guys, thanks for joining us for this week's Thursday Thought. We're still rolling in our series titled Just a Phase. Hopefully you enjoyed last week's talk with Beth Shimke. Just a wonderful, wonderful message. If you didn't, go back in our YouTube channel here. Check out that video. Be encouraged. It was a wonderful teaching last week. This week I want to talk about a phase that I went through in my adolescence. It was my favorite phase of life. It was my punk rock phase. Now, I'm sure that comes as a huge surprise to you wearing a Vans sweatshirt as a 30-year-old man, but I went through a massive punk rock phase. And when I say that, that means that I did not listen to bands like A Good Charlotte or Simple Plan or Green Day because they weren't quite punk enough. No, I was down with NoFX, Bad Religion. I was a fan of Pennywise and other bands like No Use for a Name. Bands that now, as an adult, I listen back to and I go, oh gosh, that musical content was terrible. I was so obsessed with punk rock growing up. I loved everything about the punk rock scene. I had all kinds of weird studded belts. I exclusively wore Dickies and Vans. I couldn't wear Chuck Taylors because my feet were too wide. I was all about it, and I was all about raging against the system. I was all about anarchy because as a punk rock fan, that's what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to hate your governing authorities and feel that they were oppressive and mean. The challenge was that as a young follower of Jesus, there was a bit of a discrepancy between my punk rock angst and what I saw at times in Scripture. Growing up as a hot-headed young man, not only because I was into punk rock, just because of who I am, I just hated being told what to do. My dad owned his own business growing up, and so even watching my dad, he didn't necessarily have a boss to answer to, and so if he didn't like the guy that was telling him what to do at work, well, he could only be mad at himself. See, I had a bit of a hard time submitting to and dealing with authority growing up. And right now, we hear this idea of submission to authorities and submitting particularly to governing authorities talked about a lot. In fact, I've heard that phrase, submit to your governing authorities, probably more in the last 4 months than I think I have in the last 4 years of my life. And that phrase, it comes from some scripture that we see in the New Testament. But I think sometimes that phrase maybe gets bent, twisted, manipulated to mean some things that perhaps it doesn't necessarily mean. I think sometimes people will use that phrase to strong-arm folks into some things that they maybe ought not be doing. And so we see this phrase of submitting to governing authorities, both with Peter and Paul in the New Testament. We see this kind of begin in the book of Acts. I want to talk about what happens with Peter first. In the book of Acts chapter 12, you can read this on your own. We're not going to look at this scripture right now, but in the book of Acts chapter 12, I'll summarize. The king Herod arrests a bunch of believers. He puts James, the brother of John, to death, murders him outright, puts Peter into prison, holds him there for a while, and then prepares to have a public trial to determine his guilt or innocence for the crimes that Herod is charging against him. Insurrection, stirring up, quote, riots, and just disturbing the peace. Now, if you thought this was going to be a fair trial, if you thought there was going to be any type of justice, wrong. This was not a equitable justice system they had in place then. And so Peter is sitting in jail. He is awaiting what will most certainly be a crooked trial the next day that will lead to his death as well. And that night, while Peter's sitting in jail, an angel shows up, breaks him loose out of this jail cell, leads him out the prison doors. The chains around him are broken, and he's led to freedom. Legendary worship songs are written about this experience here in Acts chapter 12. But what's interesting is after this encounter that Peter has with an angel, where he's led to captivity from an oppressive government, he later writes this in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2. He says this, verse 13. It says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." And then he says this in verse 17, "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God." That all sounds great, but then he says this, "Honor the emperor." Now that's wild. We don't just see this type of encounter and these words with Peter. We see this actually also in the book of Acts, a few chapters earlier in Acts chapter 9. While Paul's in Damascus, he has to escape a crooked city governor who's trying to capture him and assassinate him. And so Paul ends up being lowered out of this window in the city wall through this wicker basket, and he's able to escape a oppressive governing body. But later on, Paul will write in his letter to the church in Rome, he'll say, let every person be subject to their governing authorities. Submit to your governing authorities. What is he saying here? For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, it would seem at face value there's a disconnect between the words of both Peter and Paul and their actions. It would seem that something isn't quite right here. But let's take a look a little bit deeper. Let's look at the actual words that are used here. In Greek, the original language that these New Testament documents were written in, the word hupotasso means submit or be subject to. It literally means this, to arrange things in an orderly manner underneath. There's an implication when this word shows up in many other documents of respect, of behaving with dignity towards your interaction with another person. That's the word hupotasso. But there's another word in Greek, hupokouo, which literally means obey. It means to conform, to follow a command, to bow down to an authority figure as a subordinate. Oftentimes, this Greek word, hupokuou, is used alongside of a Hebrew word, shama, which means hear, but the biblical implication of those who hear is that they hear and they act. That's how we get to obey for this word. And see, Peter and Paul could have used the Greek word for obey, but they chose not to. See, they didn't use the word hupokouo, they used hupotasso. See, hupokouo, it appears 21 times in the New Testament, and it always references some type of hierarchy that's in place, like how a parent has authority over children. Children should obey your parents. The word will say that slaves should obey their masters. Now, pause right there. It's important that we apply appropriate context, because when we see slavery depicted in the Bible, we're talking about something that is completely different from the system that we see in the English slave trade, the American slave trade, that we're dealing with the ramifications of here in our nation today. We're talking about two totally different systems. In fact, the system that we have in place here, it's specifically outlawed in the book of Leviticus. I think it's chapter 16, verse 12. So we're talking about a totally different type of submission to masters here, obedience to masters. See, in New Testament Greek, obey and submit, those two words, they can work in synergy, but they're not synonymous. They're not the same thing. And I would argue that perhaps, maybe, one of these words has more to do with attitude, while the other has to do with our action. So we see in the book of Exodus, there's a precedence for some of this. The Hebrew midwives disobey the order from Pharaoh to murder all of the newborn male boys. Daniel, you remember this from our series a few weeks ago, Daniel defies the king's decree to only pray to him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they defy a king's order to only worship an idol of the king. See, sometimes unjust laws, they have to be protested. And if you're a part of this family of believers, that statement might have been frustrating for you to hear, that sometimes protest is necessary. But if you're a part of this family of believers, you're a part of the Protestant faith. And now many years later, the divide between Catholicism and Protestantism, there's been a reconciliation between some of these different ideals and practices that were unjust. But don't get a soft view on how Jesus' followers have historically handled major disagreements. See, you don't submit by going along with injustice. You submit, and this is hard, you submit by accepting the consequence that comes with speaking against it. See, there's no biblical model that advocates obeying corrupt, wicked instruction. Not obeying it, but there is an invitation for followers of Jesus to die to self, to stand up or take a knee for what's right. My punk rock 16-year-old self wanted chaos and carnage. I didn't just not want to obey my authority, I didn't want to submit to them either. I wanted to have a bad attitude towards anyone who told me what to do. But that's not how God would have us to live. See, we don't serve a God of chaos and anarchy and disorder. We serve a God of beautiful design. A God of chaos and disorder didn't design ecosystems and solar systems. He didn't design the way that the human body functions within itself. No, he's a God of order. He's a God of order. He's also a God of justice. And he invites us to help see that enacted here on the earth. And so the challenge for you and I today is to posture ourselves appropriately so that we can reflect this. I hope whatever you're going through today, whatever phase of life you find yourself in, you take comfort in the scripture, knowing that God is for you, he's not against you, and he invites you to live life his way. Thanks for joining us today. Share this video with a friend, subscribe to our channel. We'll see you next week.